The morning sun rose over the deserts of New Mexico, but for Walter White, daylight brought no comfort. Every mile he drove felt like borrowed time, blood still soaking slowly through the bandage wrapped tight around his side. His hands gripped the steering wheel with fading strength as the old pickup truck rattled across forgotten back roads, far from the highways he knew would soon be crawling with police. Every radio station carried the same breaking news, the same three facts repeated over and over like a drumbeat. Jack Welker's gang had been eliminated. Jesse Pinkman had escaped captivity. And Walter White, the infamous Heisenberg, was officially listed as missing, presumed wounded, possibly dead. Reporters argued back and forth over the airwaves, debating whether he'd collapsed somewhere out in the desert or somehow slipped away from the massacre alive. Walter reached over and switched the radio off before anyone could finish another sentence about him. He didn't need to hear the theories. He was living the answer. For the first time in years he had become a ghost, a man seen everywhere in headlines, splashed across every screen in the state, yet nowhere in person. A name without a body. And for now that was exactly what kept him alive. By the afternoon, his condition had worsened. The pain in his side had sharpened into something unbearable, radiating with every bump in the road, and his vision blurred each time he blinked for too long. He knew, with the same clinical certainty he'd once used to calculate yield percentages, that he needed real medical attention. But walking into a hospital would end everything within minutes. Every emergency room in the state would be watching for a face just like his. So instead, he pulled off the cracked asphalt near an abandoned service station that had long since fallen into ruin, its shattered windows and faded signage half swallowed by drifting desert sand, rusted fuel pumps standing like tombstones in the heat. Walter searched the building room by room for anything useful. Most of the shelves had been picked clean years earlier by scavengers, but beneath a broken counter he found a dusty first aid cabinet, old gauze, a bottle of disinfectant gone cloudy with age, and a handful of basic surgical tools. Using a cracked mirror still bolted crookedly to the wall, he cleaned and rebandaged the wound himself, his reflection fractured into a dozen jagged pieces staring back at him. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain tearing through his body, but he refused to stop, refused to even slow down. Years of solving impossible problems through cold, patient science had taught him one lesson above every other. Panic never saved anyone. Only precision did. Nearly 100 miles away, the DA had transformed Jack Welker's compound into the largest crime scene New Mexico had ever seen. Federal agents photographed every inch of the wrecked laboratory while forensic teams cataloged weapons, cash, chemicals, and bodies in grim, methodical rows. Among them stood men who had once worked alongside Agent Stephen Gomez, still haunted by his death, and Hank Schrader's, still carrying that particular kind of grief that never fully closes. For a few short hours, they believed they were finally closing the darkest chapter in the agency's history. Then the forensic report from the tunnel came back. Fresh blood. Fresh footprints, dragging and uneven. Clear evidence that someone had crawled away from the compound after the shooting, bleeding the entire way. The blood matched Walter White's DNA exactly. A heavy silence fell over the briefing room as every investigator present understood, all at once, what it meant. Heisenberg had survived. Within hours, the entire investigation shifted onto a new axis. A nationwide manhunt was launched. Walter White's photograph went out to every airport, every bus station, every train terminal and highway checkpoint in the region. Border crossings were placed on high alert. News channels broke into their regular programming again, this time with an update that stunned viewers from coast to coast. Authorities now believed Walter White had escaped the compound alive, despite a serious gunshot wound. The story tore across the country within minutes. Social media lit up with speculation and half-formed theories. Some claimed Heisenberg had already crossed into Mexico. Others insisted he'd left the country entirely, perhaps years ago in spirit if not in fact. Conspiracy threads sprang up almost instantly, recasting him as a criminal mastermind who had orchestrated his own disappearance from the very beginning. A myth built faster than the facts could ever catch up to it. Across Albuquerque, Skylar White sat frozen in her small living room, watching the press conference unfold. Every word from the DA podium felt like another stone placed on her chest. She had spent months trying to distance herself and her children from Walter's crimes, quietly hoping that his death, however it came, would finally let them move forward. Instead, the nightmare had simply changed shape. Walter Jr. stood beside her in silence, staring at his father's photograph looming behind the podium on screen. The anger he'd carried for months tangled with something he refused to say out loud: uncertainty. If his father was really alive, what did that mean for what was left of their family? Would he try to reach them? Would the violence that had swallowed their lives start all over again? Neither Skylar nor Flynn had an answer. Neither one wanted to say the question out loud. Marie Schrader's reaction was entirely different. The moment she heard Walter had survived, her grief hardened instantly into resolve. She demanded, loudly and publicly, that the DA never stop searching until Walter White was in custody. For Marie, there had never been any real justice, not while Hank and Gomez stayed in the ground and the man responsible kept finding new ways to keep breathing. She refused to let him vanish into the desert a second time. Elsewhere, Jesse Pinkman had already crossed into a neighboring state in Todd's stolen El Camino before finally abandoning it deep in a remote stretch of forest. Every unfamiliar sound made him flinch. Every distant siren sent him deeper into hiding, off the roads and into the tree line. He wanted exactly one thing now: to disappear completely, to stop existing in any file, any photograph, any headline ever again. But when he ducked into a small roadside diner just to buy something to eat, the television mounted above the counter stopped him cold. Walter White's photograph filled the screen beneath a bold, blinking headline: Heisenberg believed to be alive. Jesse froze mid-step, tray still in hand. For a moment he genuinely wondered if exhaustion was making him hallucinate. He had watched Walt bleeding out on that concrete floor. He had been certain, absolutely certain, the old man wouldn't make it through the night. And yet here was the evidence, broadcast in bold red letters, saying otherwise. Jesse set the tray down without touching the food and slipped quietly back out into the parking lot. If Walt was really alive out there somewhere, then none of it, was actually over. Deep in the mountains of northern New Mexico, Walter finally reached the abandoned mining settlement he'd marked on the old map days earlier. Once home to dozens of working families, the town had sat empty for decades since the mine shut down, its houses weathered gray beneath the relentless sun, windows broken out by years of wind, silence, and neglect. Walter chose a small cabin near the edge of the settlement, half-collapsed walls hiding it from the road entirely. It offered nothing close to comfort, but it offered something worth far more right now: invisibility. He spent the next 2 days simply trying to survive the recovery, rationing scraps of food scavenged from nearby hunting cabins and boiling water over an old cast-iron wood stove that groaned with every use. His fever came in waves, spiking and breaking and spiking again. More than once, lying alone in the dark, he genuinely believed infection would finish what the bullet hadn't. Somehow, stubbornly, he endured anyway. As his strength slowly crept back, Walter noticed his thoughts drifting away from pure survival and toward something else entirely, everything that still felt unfinished. He had freed Jesse. He had secured money for his children through Gretchen and Elliot, quietly from a distance. Jack's gang was gone, wiped off the map in under a minute. By every rational measure, his story should have already ended. And yet something in him refused to accept that ending as final. Heisenberg had always demanded control above all else. Control of the product, the territory, the narrative. Now the world believed it already knew how his story finished, and Walter found he couldn't bear the thought of strangers writing that last chapter for him. One evening, hunched by the dim glow of a battery radio inside the cabin, a stray news report caught his attention. Authorities in Arizona had seized several pounds of crystal meth during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Ordinarily, Walter would have let a story like that pass right by him. But the reporter added one detail that made him go very still. Investigators were describing the seized product as unusually pure, with a distinctive blue tint almost identical to the meth once tied to Heisenberg. Walter slowly lowered the radio. That wasn't possible. His formula lived in the minds of only a handful of people, and every one of them was gone. Gail Boetticher, dead. Todd Alquist, dead. Every chemist Jack's crew had ever employed, dead in that compound. And Jesse would never cook again, not after everything that had been done to him. So who exactly was making blue meth? At first, Walter told himself it had to be a cheap imitation. Criminals copied successful products constantly, it meant nothing. But over the following days, more reports trickled in through the static. Blue meth in Arizona. Then Nevada. Then western Texas, spreading fast along familiar highway corridors. Every report described the same extraordinary purity, the same rapidly expanding distribution network. This wasn't some small-time copycat slapping a color on cheap product. Someone was building an empire around the Heisenberg name. Walter stared down at a stack of newspapers spread across the dusty cabin table, each headline landing like a personal insult. His formula, his life's work, the one achievement he'd always believed proved his brilliance beyond any doubt, had quietly become someone else's business. Worse, Every crime committed under that blue crystal would inevitably point investigators straight back toward the name Heisenberg, dragging his family deeper into a story he thought had already ended at Jack Welker's compound. The legacy he believed was finally buried had somehow been dug back up and put to work by someone else entirely. As night fell over the silent mountains, Walter stepped out of the cabin and looked across the empty, moonlit landscape. For the first time since his escape, the fear that had lived behind his eyes for days quietly disappeared, replaced by something far more dangerous. Purpose. Somewhere out there, beyond the dark ridgeline, an unknown player had reached out and taken the one symbol that had ever truly defined him. Walter White had spent every mile of this journey trying to escape Heisenberg. Now Heisenberg was being worn by someone else, like a mask stolen off his own face. And that was something he could never allow. Hundreds of miles away, inside a DEA evidence lab humming under fluorescent light, technicians examined the newly seized blue meth pulled from that Arizona traffic stop. One chemist ran it side by side against archived samples recovered years earlier from Walter White's original operation. The room went quiet as the results finally loaded onto the monitor. The purity wasn't just similar. It was 99.1%. An agent reached for the phone without a word, dialed, and when the line connected, spoke the sentence that would change the entire direction of the investigation. Get every available unit. Heisenberg isn't running, he's back.